Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott. Today, we have a very special guest, Vijaya Kaza, who's the Chief Security Officer and Head of Engineering for Trust and Safety at Airbnb, an impact and results-driven C-level technology and business executive with experience leading engineering, product management, design, information security, and operations. Vijaya was recently named as one of the Female Quotient and Deloitte's top 30 women in cyber for 2023. Welcome, Vijaya. We are thrilled to have you join us.
Likewise, so honored to be here. I'm a huge fan of Radical Candor and all of the great work you're doing. And I'm especially very excited about the topic that we have today on collaboration.
Thank you so much. And for those of you listening, Jason is having a power outage and Amy is not with us. So it's just me and Vijaya today. So Vijaya, here is my question for you. There are so many books on being a great leader, but I can't think of a single book on being a great colleague, being a great cross-functional colleague, or just a great team member, a great peer. Why is this?
Wow, that is such an excellent question. I think generally there is an acknowledgement that leadership is a really vast subject. And being a good leader and leading people and organizations, generally people understand it is complex and requires skill and experience. And therefore, there's lots and lots of material, whether it's books, trainings, you name it, to train people on that. But at least my theory is that people think they know what it means to be a good colleague and take collaboration for granted. And they don't really give much thought into what good looks like when it comes to being a colleague and being a great peer. What do you think?
I think you're exactly right. I think this is something that we think we know how to do, but we don't actually know how to do. I remember at one point I had left a job at one company and joined another company, and I had lunch with one of my peers who I always really had liked, but I felt like I hadn't gotten enough out of the relationship or given enough to the relationship. And we hadn't been as close as I felt like we ought to have. And I just asked her point blank, like, why didn't we work more closely together? And she said something interesting to me. She said, Kim, you never asked for help. And I was like, oh my gosh. Like,
Oh, wow.
I knew I was supposed to ask my direct reports for help, but I didn't realize that I should have been asking her for help and she would have given it to me. So
Very
that's
interesting.
yeah, that's part of it. But what is good collaboration look like from your perspective?
Collaboration to me feels like one of the most used buzzwords in the corporate world, as you know. Every
Yeah.
leadership training, every day we hear about this word hundreds of times. Yet I think it's often really misunderstood because I think traditionally collaboration has always been equated to being agreeable, right?
Yes.
If you think of a colleague or somebody that is always touted as being collaborative, picture somebody, right?
Yeah.
Anybody. More often than not, you think of somebody that is easy to work with, that gets along, is not very conflict oriented. You don't have lots of debates. And that's typically what is touted as being collaborative.
But
But I think
that is not collaborative, is it?
that
Because
is
you're
being agreeable. I think,
yeah.
That's not really, a true collaboration, right? And so, to me, true collaboration, or if you want to call it radical collaboration, because I know you like the word
Yes.
radical.
And I love it 2x2. I sense one coming on.
Yeah. So that to me, radical collaboration is where, you're focused on really producing great outcomes together. And the focus is not really on maintaining harmony and being agreeable. So, in that type of collaboration, you actually have lots of debates, lots of
Yeah.
disagreements. But at the end of the day, you really come up with something that both parties are really proud of. And naturally and organically, very strong relationships and bonds are formed, right? So that to me is what great looks like from a collaboration perspective. And it is easier said than done, but I have seen that work well in at least in a few situations, right?
Mm-hmm.
One is like, if you think of a situation where people already have a lot of mutual trust and respect for each other,
Mm-hmm.
radical collaboration works really well because, if I respect you, and this happened for us even in this short duration when we were trying to collaborate for this podcast, we could push and pull on each other and say, hey, what about this? What about that? And, I disagree here and there. And ultimately we come up with something really great because I have a lot of respect for you to begin with.
And as do I for you.
Yeah.
So, and I think we came up with a better, as a result of disagreeing with each other, we came up with a better solution, I think.
Absolutely. And the other situation where I've seen that work really well is, in a case like, let's say, an M&A integration, right? There
Mm-hmm.
are two companies that are coming together. They don't already know each other really well. So there is no possibility of having mutual respect and trust already built in. But in a situation like that, you could still cultivate this sort of radical collaboration by providing very specific expectations for the teams that are involved and say, here's what we expect as a shared outcome, and collectively we will be successful, and this is what we need in this specific deadline. And by doing that and setting those shared outcomes and expectations very clear, you can really promote that type of collaboration. And in fact, that actually happened to me in one of my previous companies where we brought in two companies that we were trying to integrate. There were lots of disagreements, lots of debates along the way as we were trying to figure out what is a common roadmap and how should we integrate the products and teams. But at the end of the day, both teams understood that what's at stake and how they're both measure jointly on producing this outcome. And that actually helped build very strong relationships. And to this day, one of the best outcomes that I've seen.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories about a similar situation comes from Russ Laraway when Google had bought DoubleClick, and he was responsible for integrating one of the DoubleClick teams into his team at Google. And he did something that I thought was really interesting. He had everybody sit down and give voice to what they were afraid of. Like, what
Mm-hmm.
is the worst thing that you believe about this other team?
Yeah.
And it really helped them. It was, high intent to collaborate, and it really helped them like give voice to the disagreements that they had about what kind of culture they wanted, what was going to make them successful. And that team, he's still friends with a number of people who are in that room to this day. So the collaboration, not only did it yield a good outcome, it yielded great relationships.
Yeah.
And in
Totally.
fact, yeah, I'd love to hear a couple more stories from you about like specifics. Like think about a peer or someone who you collaborated with and really well. What did it look like? What did it feel like? What happened?
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. Every situation is slightly different. And perhaps, before we get into those specific examples, it might be helpful to even take a step back and think about, just what are the different types of collaboration that are even possible, right? Not every interaction has to be the best possible radical type of collaboration that we just touched upon. There are some collaborations that may be appropriate for the type of situation that we are in. But to put that in context, perhaps it's useful to look at collaboration through two dimensions. The
Mm-hmm.
first being intent. Think of
Mm-hmm.
this as a y-axis where you have high intent to collaborate.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because I always forget. The y-axis is the up and down one.
Up and down, yes.
Okay.
And high intent to collaborate versus low intent to collaborate on the other end. And the
Mm-hmm.
second dimension being the x-axis, the horizontal axis, where you can think of the approach to collaboration on the left side being the focus is very much on creating harmonious relationships or relationships in general. And the right side being more about how do we actually come up with fantastic joint outcomes that we can be proud of, right? So
Yeah.
that's the spectrum.
Yeah.
So
So one of the things that you and I talked about, and I thought was a good conversation, is this feels a little bit like the radical candor framework. So on the vertical axis, I call it care personally. You call it intent to collaborate, which is interesting. I mean, in some senses, often collaboration happens with someone you don't know at all. So it's hard to say you care personally, but you can
right.
intend to collaborate with them. And on the horizontal axis, I call it challenge directly. And on the on the left hand side would be what I call false harmony. But I think focusing on what you have to do to achieve a certain outcome is an interesting way to think about it.
Correct. And because there is no feedback involved in this process, it's more of working together. The caring personally aspect changes differently, right? It's in
Yeah.
this context, it's a little bit different. That said,
Sorry, before you go on, you just made me think of something. I think that a lot of what happens in collaboration is not feedback, but disagreement. And it's interesting to kind of tease apart the difference between feedback and disagreement for a moment. I mean, I think, like, let's imagine that you and I are on different teams and we're peers and we're trying to decide whether or not we should enter the market in Hungary. And I think we should, and you think we shouldn't. And so we're disagreeing about the size of the market, the
mhm,
opportunity. That's a disagreement. That needs to happen in public, actually, with other people who are also working on it. And it's not feedback, it's disagreement. But if you think that I want to go into the market in Hungary because I have family in Hungary and I have an ulterior motive, now all of a sudden that's criticism, and that's something you need to say in private to me. Do you agree with that sort of it's may sound like a nuance, but I think it's actually pretty important to think about for
I agree with
collaboration.
that. I mean, if you think there is a personal agenda behind that disagreement, I think that it's appropriate to take that privately. But I think what I see more often happen is people, even if they disagree with you, they don't
Mhm.
often speak up for the fear of coming across as
Yes.
not being collaborative.
Yes.
And they hold on to the opinions at the detriment of both themselves as well as the organization, right?
Yeah.
Because, sometimes they hold back because of insincerity, I would call it, to say, if I'm speaking against my boss or somebody higher status in the organization in particular, I don't want to say that. I want to be yes person, and I'm okay being insincere and seem like I'm agreeing.
Yeah.
But a lot of times it's also because they just don't know how to disagree effectively,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
So this goes back to the question originally you were asking about, why isn't there more training on this topic and
Yes.
more books to help people really learn how to do this effectively?
Yeah, and I think that even the word disagreeable like carries some uh, value judgments with it that maybe it shouldn't. I mean, I think Adam Grant and other people have written about the importance of being disagreeable some of the time. But when you think about, like, there's the big five personality attributes, like agreeable to disagreeable. It tends to be they're not supposed to be good to bad on a continuum of good to bad, but it sure feels like a continuum, like not neurotic to neurotic. Like, I think we all know that sometimes our neuroses are very helpful to
Yeah.
to us, but it doesn't, like, generally people don't want to be disagreeable, and yet it's essential.
It
In
is
fact,
essential. I'll give you one story. So I remember working with a person several years ago at a different company. Let's call this person Pete.
okay,
Pete was very well known for his collaboration, right,
hmm
in air quotes. And, from his peers and everybody, he gets rave reviews about how great he's to work with.
hmm
Um, but he was always very hesitant to bring up disagreements like we were talking about before. For a long time that didn't matter, but as time went on and his own direct team was super frustrated with this person, and they had to escalate because they didn't know what the conviction was on any given matter and where this person stood. And it
And
was
this person was one of Pete's
sorry, Pete.
peers?
Actually, Pete
Oh,
himself,
they
right?
were
What I'm
frustrated
saying,
with Pete. Okay, because
yeah,
he wasn't saying what he
he
really
wasn't
thought.
saying what he was meaning, and he would go with the flow. So his team really saw through that and escalated to say, "Hey, this is now actually impacting us and our work because we really don't know where Pete stands on a
Yeah,
given matter."
yeah,
Right. And, we think we're going in one direction and suddenly we change direction to something else because he doesn't want to
yeah,
disagree. So, I mean, and Pete really didn't have any clue. That's kind of how he was coming across. Again, it's not for bad intent and insincerity. He just didn't know how to disagree effectively until he got that feedback and coaching. So the cost though is, I think he lost trust of his team because he came across as, it was his integrity was in question and he was not being authentic, right? Not
yeah,
to mention the business results that suffered as a result.
yeah.
So, I think that's the danger of, really coming across as simply agreeable without stating your opinion on any matter, especially for leadership roles.
Yeah, one of the things that I've told people who are reluctant to disagree, and I found it. I mean, I was raised in the South as like one of my most vivid memories is I was at my parents were having a dinner party,
Hmm.
and one of their guests said he didn't think that recycling was a good idea, and I disagreed with him, and I said so, and I said why. And I remember my mom told me later, "Oh, you shouldn't disagree." That's how I was raised, not to
Yeah.
disagree. So it didn't come naturally to me. And at one point in my career, somebody explained to me that if I disagreed with someone, that I was giving them a gift to explain why I disagreed
Absolutely.
because maybe I was wrong. And by saying I disagreed, I was giving them the opportunity to explain to me
100%.
why I was wrong. And maybe I was right, at which point I was giving them a gift.
Yeah,
So
like
so
you,
yeah.
Kim, I was also raised in a culture in India where you don't speak up against elders, and no matter
Yeah.
what they say, right? It's not in the culture, and it is very interesting, actually, what you have to learn to do that. But one of the things I would say is, if you truly respect someone, you have to be genuine, right? You cannot pretend to be respectful and agree because that only lasts so long, and when it is found out, the trust is broken really badly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would
Yes.
say if you respect someone, you need to be even more candid and more
Yes.
disagreeable and let
Yes.
them know if you disagree.
Yes. Yeah. So that Pete was an example, I think, of what you would call false harmony. Is that right?
Yeah, I call that like traditional collaboration that is most prevalent in most organizations, where the intent that y-axis is very high. However, the focus is so much on maintaining harmonious relationships, even sometimes at the peril of producing great outcomes. Right. So that's the traditional model for collaboration.
Yeah, and ironically, it's not good for your relationships in the long run if
Absolutely not.
you that kind of false harmony because
Yeah.
you that's how real what I call I imagine you spend a lot of your career struggling with technical debt. I spent a lot of my career struggling with feedback debt. And that's what happens
Yeah, I
in
think
that.
there is a parallel with what you call as, I think, ruinous empathy in the radical
Yes,
kind of
yeah,
model. I
exactly.
think it's very
Exactly.
similar to that. Yeah,
Yeah, it's not real, it's not sort of real collaboration. It's, and, examples of this abound. There was a team that I worked with, and this was a cross-functional collaboration, and they were not going to be able to deliver something that this other team needed but because they wanted to protect the relationship, they didn't tell the
Right.
other team. And they
Right.
didn't tell the other team, and they didn't tell, and then when they finally did tell the other team, like, there was nothing, time had run out to do something about it. And it was, it was an example of bad news early is what really spares your relationship. But often when we're reluctant to disappoint a peer, a cross-functional peer in particular, we keep delaying the bad news, and that's what really damages the relationship. In fact, in Radical Candor, I talk about what does infinite damage to your relationships is telling the person after you promised the thing that actually it's not coming for another few weeks.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting that there is such a difference between being truly respectful versus acting respectful,
Yes.
which doesn't take you too far, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And there comes a point when there's, like, when you've truly lost respect for someone, where you just don't even bother. And that is a disaster for your
Right.
relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So how else can it go wrong if we go back to your sort of collaboration framework? How else can collaboration go wrong?
Yeah. I mean, the worst quadrant or worst place you could be obviously is if the intent is low to collaborate to begin with. And
Mhm.
also the focus is on relationships that are potentially already bad. So you're
Yeah.
basically avoiding each other at all costs, right? And
Yes.
we shouldn't
Yeah.
even call this collaboration at all. It's a non-collaboration quadrant, right?
It's avoidant, avoidance,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um,
So thankfully, I haven't seen that happen too much in the organizations that I was there before, but it did happen in one place several years ago. And if I think back and what was the reason for such a toxic environment and why that existed, I think it goes back to, the culture of promoting um, and rewarding hero culture, and
mhm.
which then led to silos. So not only is there no incentive to collaborate, there is actually incentive to not collaborate and become a
Yeah.
hero. So that it goes back to this thinking that I can only be successful if you cannot, and
Yes.
that just is such a detriment to everything from there.
Yeah. Yeah. There was one point in my career where I had joined a new company, and it had a very different culture than the previous company where I worked. And someone told me that at this company, when we notice someone screwing up, we sell tickets to watch. Like, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, you mean, like,
Hmm.
I'm gonna be messing up, and rather than coming to me and telling me that I'm
Yeah,
messing up, you're gonna go tell other people to go come watch me mess up." Like, that was the ultimately that was, I've rarely felt that unsafe. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this is
yeah.
not not a
I mean,
culture for
can you
me."
imagine where people are in those types of situations? How much energy they must be spending in totally non-productive things, totally watching their back or trying to
Yeah.
figure out, who's going to come backstab me at this point and what should I do to stay ahead of it, or watching, buying tickets to watch somebody else suffer. It's
Ugh.
just unbelievable. So
Yeah,
sad.
yeah. Not it does not yield good work or good relationships.
Yeah.
And yet it does happen. I mean, we don't talk about it enough because I think probably everybody listening to this can think about a moment in their career where they
Hmm.
were in this kind of environment where people were avoiding each other and wishing each other ill.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's very human.
Yeah. Totally.
Um,
And I'll say this, the other type of collaboration, the only other type that we haven't touched upon here, I would call it functional collaboration, where,
mhm.
it's not necessarily bad, right? What I mean is, so their natural intent to collaborate is perhaps low, but people say they're forced to work on something together and produce something, they'll work. The relationship is probably transactional, not so deep, but they'll get work done, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll give an example of, a while ago, there was somebody on my team that was struggling to deliver a project. And I decided to bring some external consultant to
Mm-hmm.
augment the skill set that was missing and help this person finish the project, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this person that was struggling, they didn't have strong intent to collaborate because, they didn't obviously like the consultant coming in, but they understood what had to be done and they
Yeah.
got along enough to produce and finish the project in time. And, for that situation, because it was a temporary one project, one off thing, and an external consultant coming in, that level of collaboration was functional and it was completely appropriate, right? You don't have to invest necessarily in kind of building a deep relationship between those two people and radically collaborate.
Yeah, it's sort of like transactional collaboration.
Right.
Maybe it's not super duper functional. And usually I imagine that has to be kind of top down. You have to be or circumstances, maybe not necessarily top down, but circumstances force you to work with someone who you don't want to work with. And the interesting thing about that kind of collaboration is that sometimes real friendships emerge from it. Sometimes it moves up from
Yeah,
functional collaboration to radical collaboration.
100%. I think if you work long enough and, eventually develop that mutual trust and respect we talked about, it can go, it's almost like a maturity model, right? You can go from one level to the next in some
Mhm.
ways, and you could go
Mhm.
from that transactional, functional collaboration to radical, totally possible.
Yeah. And I tend to think about collaboration in very glowing terms. I think that all of humanity's greatest accomplishments are team efforts. Like very few of humanity's great accomplishments were just the work of one individual. It's almost always teams of people. However, when I was writing Radical Respect, my editor, Tim Bartlett, I'm throwing you a curveball, so feel free to feel free to say answer your own question, Kim. But I was just think something you said just triggered this in my mind. He really asked me some questions about collaboration. He's like, really, there were some horrible examples of collaboration. And what I learned later was that as he was telling me this, he was editing another book called Cold Crematorium about what happened with the Nazi regime in Auschwitz. And
Wow.
it,
Mhm.
it it was really a chilling example of people of the worst, people collaborating for evil, not for good. So in general, I think we try to collaborate for good. But how can you make sure that I mean, even the word collaboration has a bad connotation with World War II. Um, so how can you make sure that collaboration is achieving and moving towards positive ends and not negative ends? Do you have thoughts on that?
That's a really interesting question, right? I think it goes back to some of the things we were talking about. Ultimately, everybody that is part of that work needs to feel comfortable and want to collaborate. Their intent to collaborate has to be there. And so, if
Mhm.
I am a person that disagrees with that mission,
Mhm.
I better speak up and I better get
Yeah.
out of that if I'm not willing to collaborate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, you are becoming part of it, right? And you're being a willing participant to whatever
Yeah.
that is.
So maybe that kind of top-down forced collaboration is where we go wrong. Radical collaboration, hopefully enough people are going to speak up and say this is wrong. And that's what'll keep us on the path towards good things and not bad things. Let's talk some more about radical collaboration, about what it looks like and feels like when it's really going right. Because there have been times in my life, like I remember at one point when I was at Google, I was having some conflict with the product management team, with one person in particular on the product management team, and I was sort of forced to. So it was, I was, I don't know, forced is a strong word, but I was strongly encouraged to collaborate
Mhm.
with this person. So it like started out as kind of uh, that kind of collaboration. And then as I got to know this person better and I got to understand how talented they were, I remember I had this moment like, oh my gosh, I can quit worrying about this. This person is way better at this set of what needs to be done than I could ever be. And it was like all of a sudden, and he felt the same about what I was doing. And all of a sudden, we were like bionic prostheses for one another. Like he could do what I could never do. I could do what he could never do. And together we worked really, really well together. And it was like, I'll never forget that moment of realizing, oh, this whole category of things that was on my dreaded list, I can just like hand that list to him. I don't have to worry about it anymore.
That's
So,
right.
talk to me about some of your highlights of radical collaboration with cross functional peers.
Yeah, I think, like you said, when you experience that type of true collaboration, you are in that flow, right? You no
Hmm.
longer are looking at each other and figuring out, oh, I'm doing this, you're doing this. There is no boundaries, right?
Yeah.
You're extending each other, like you said, and without fear of who's getting credit for what. People are working together to produce a great outcome. And there is no fear of, hey, if I say something, this is going to hurt this person, but you're actually welcoming disagreements, you're welcoming
Hmm.
debates. And really don't have that separation of us versus them, right? That's kind of
Yeah.
how it feels. And it's truly, I think the best way I can think of is experiencing that flow.
Yeah.
I've had that experience multiple times. And in one situation where I experienced that was because we already had that mutual trust and respect to begin with.
Hmm.
And so it was easier to stop and say, if this person is disagreeing, I need to listen carefully because they are a subject matter expert, and you kind of have to pay attention and listen. It kind of gives you that incentive to go and listen, and makes the outcome so much better because you're listening to each other, and willing to change your position, because you are going in with the assumption of, I'm going to have my firm opinions but loosely held, and I'm willing to change them based on what I'm hearing. And it just works and clicks. And you're no longer looking at who's doing what. And as we talked about in my other example of the M&A integration.
Yeah, yeah, and I think also, I mean, I don't want to take the bionic prosthesis analogy too far, but I think I've never had a prosthesis, but I understand it can be quite painful to get one fitted, and sometimes initially it hurt.
Yeah.
You are going to hurt each other a little bit,
Mhm.
and sort of being willing to move through that so that you can become those bionic prostheses for one another is really important. And I think one of the tricks is to find the motivation to get through that pain, so that you can work well together, because you are going to say things in ways that are not ideal, especially as you're beginning a collaboration. So how do you teach teams? How do you inspire teams to move through that pain and to be willing to endure the friction and the noise of what we call the rock tumbler when we talk about debate? What do you do?
Yeah, I think, it's all about, like most things in leadership, about culture and the culture that you're setting as a leader for the organization, right? And as we were talking about before, if you don't encourage this hero behaviors and hero culture and celebrate team success versus individual
Hmm.
success, that is a loud and clear message for the teams on what sorts of
Yes.
things are being rewarded within this organization. Who you fire, who you hire, who you promote. that's what the culture is about, right? And people notice what you're doing and what you're rewarding. And the other thing is to, really set the clear expectations about, the shared goals and outcomes, and providing additional incentives for people to really come together, because we can only be successful as a team, not as individual. And here's how we would get there, through those shared outcomes and goals. And finally, I would say probably the other thing is it's making it super clear that it's okay to challenge each other's ideas. It's not only okay, it's actually expected
Yeah, it's
to
not
challenge,
okay not to.
not to, right? And challenge each other's ideas. So those are the types of things, it's really about watching, observing, providing the timely feedback to say, hey, I noticed that you were holding back in this meeting and not really stating your opinion. Why do you do that? What's the fear? And I really want you to speak up and
Yeah.
disagree when you do. Those every little moments help in creating and teaching that sort of expected behavior, right?
Yeah. I think that the culture thing that you mentioned is so important and so hard to know culture, it feels so amorphous. Like one of the things that I used to try to do to create a culture of debate and disagreement that is really essential to collaboration is to make it fun, to make it,
Mhm.
to make it something that we enjoyed doing, to encourage people to switch roles. For example, I can tell that Jane really thinks X and Joe really thinks Y. I want
Yeah.
Jane to argue Joe's point of view and Joe to argue Jane's point of view. I
Yeah.
think that is so helpful to get people to switch roles. When people disagree with me, I try, and I realize that I'm wrong, I try to make a really big deal of it so that people know that they're going to be rewarded for disagreeing with me.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories from Apple. I don't think this is I don't think this is the best way to do it, but I would love to get your perspective. So there was someone at Apple who had a big disagreement with Steve Jobs about some feature. And he argued with him once, he argued with him twice, he had a third argument, and then he just gave up. And he was like, well, Steve's company will do it Steve's way. And after launch, it became very clear that Steve had been wrong. and this and Steve came charging into this guy's office and he said, why do we do this? And the guy was like, well, because you said to. And
Uh-huh.
Steve looked at him and he said, and it was your job to convince me that I was wrong and you failed. And he stormed off. And he said he was like one of those moments where he's like, oh my gosh, I can't win. But on the other hand, he never forgot it. And the next time he did argue more strongly. So sort of demanding that people disagree when they disagree, I
Yeah.
think
But in
is
that
important.
example, if it is known within the company that that is what is expected, I think
Yes.
it would have been very fair to expect the person to push back the
Yes.
fourth time, the fifth time until he's heard.
Yeah.
Whereas, in other places, maybe it's not so clear, or maybe
Yeah.
there is even contradictory evidence to
Yes.
say,
Yes.
so if you
Yeah.
speak up, there is something that's going to go wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think the other thing about that case is that there was a culture where a lot of people knew it was okay to argue with Steve, but this guy was new. He didn't yet know that, and
yeah,
nobody had told him. There was somebody else who I worked with at Apple who said, Steve is a lion. When he roars at you, he expects you to roar back, but you better act like a lion when you're roaring back. you know it's going to be scary, and I thought that was he there needed to be more training like that. And
yeah.
ideally you're a leader who doesn't demand their own training team to go around explaining how to deal with you. Like that's a whole other set
Yeah.
of problems.
I really like your idea of taking each other's point of view and debating. I think that it makes a lot of sense. And another thing we could also just on similar lines is even finding one counterpoint to every argument, and gamifying that. Like, if we are
Yeah.
in a meeting, you're expected to at least bring up one disagreement, one counterpoint, just make that fun and make that part of the culture of the team. That could really help as well, and not only set the expectations but also give people a chance to practice.
Yeah. I worked at a consulting firm once that had a very strong culture of, they called it an obligation to dissent. And very often, especially when there was too much agreement, the lead partner would hand to the most junior person in the room, you know, it's your obligation to dissent. What are we missing here? And that worked. In fact, at another company where I worked, somebody had inherited a team where there was a lot of that false harmony that you're talking about, and he actually got a gavel. It said "duty to dissent" on it, and he would just pass it. So sometimes, like, little props that are kind of lighthearted can create enough humor and lightheartedness around collaboration and the disagreement that is an essential part of collaboration, that it can help.
Yeah, and send small reminders to the team on what's important, what's expected in those situations,
Yes.
right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and rewarding the kind of disagreement, even if it's a little messy. Well, listen, I want to thank you so much. I learned a ton from you. We developed a new 2x2 framework. We'll put it in the we'll put it in the show notes. And I really like what you said about, sort of, it doesn't have to go all the way to care personally. Like, just your intent to work with someone, to collaborate with someone, can get you moving in the right direction. So thank you
Absolutely.
for
Thank you
challenging
for the
my thinking.
opportunity. No, it was a lot of fun, and I am super excited and thrilled about this conversation, and I hope we can all continue to practice some of these topics that we talked about. Like communication, collaboration is also one of those things you can never learn enough.
Yeah.
We talked about all of these things doesn't mean it makes me an expert or you an expert. We all continue to practice and remind ourselves and our teams as well. So thank you for giving an opportunity to share.
Thank you. My hope for this podcast is that someone listening to it will write an excellent book on how to be a great peer, a great colleague, because we need more of those books. I know you said you didn't love to write, so probably wouldn't write that book. But maybe if someone decides to write it, they can get your help and your
If you
words
ever
of
want to
wisdom.
write a book about that, Kim, let me know. At least I can contribute. If
Okay.
not,
Okay, that's it. As soon as I finish my utopian novel, maybe I'll get on that one.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks again. And thanks to all of you all out there in podcast world listening to us. I recommend that you head to radicalcandor.com/podcast to see the show notes for this episode. Praise in public, criticize in private. If you like what you hear, please rate, review, and follow us wherever you're listening. And please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube at radicalcandor.com. And if you have criticism for us, we would welcome it. We will reward it. Please email it to us, podcast@radicalcandor.com. Bye for now.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the Company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.